"I give her 5 minutes," he whispered, his voice slick, with the kind of confidence only unearned privilege can buy. 10 tops. Marcus Thorne adjusted his silk tie in the reflection of the courtroom's glass door, a smirk playing on his lips. He leaned in toward his pale, eager intern, his voice a conspiratorial hiss meant to be overheard. "Look at her, the thrift store blazer, the hair. I've seen pro se litigants with more polish in traffic court. They're letting anyone with a grievance and a sob story in here these days. This is a waste of billable hours." 3 feet away, Imani Jordan stood perfectly still, her gaze fixed on the wood grain of the door in front of her. She heard every word. The syllables landed on her skin like tiny stinging insects, but she refused to flinch. She had learned long ago that flinching was a concession, an admission that their words had found their mark. If she flinched every time a man like Marcus Thorne underestimated her, she would live her life in a perpetual shudder. Instead, her grip tightened on the worn blue binder she held to her chest. It was her shield and her sword. Inside, hundreds of pages were organized with a precision that bordered on obsession. Handwritten tabs, divided sections, unanswered maintenance requests, photographic evidence, mold, voicemail, transcripts, and timeline of neglect. Tucked in the front was her eviction notice, folded into a tight, neat square, as if she could make it smaller, less real, by creasing it into submission. She had assembled this binder at her kitchen table over countless sleepless nights, fueled by lukewarm coffee and cold fury. For a black woman in a room like this, the truth was never enough. It had to be catalogued, cross-referenced, and weaponized. The doors swung open, and the chill that hit her wasn't from the air conditioning. It was a human cold, the frigid draft of dozens of eyes scanning her, judging her, and dismissing her before she had uttered a single word. It was the cold of smiles that were not invitations but assessments of a silence that was not peaceful but predatory. She walked down the center aisle, her low-heeled shoes making almost no sound on the polished floor. An older white woman on the jury, adorned with pearls and a pinched expression, watched her pass her lips, pursed as if she'd tasted something sour. A younger black man, dressed in a crisp button-down, made eye contact with Imani. For a fleeting second, his gaze a mixture of solidarity and fear, before quickly looking away. Imani understood. Sometimes just being seen alongside the person on trial felt like a risk. At the defendant's table sat Gerald Finch, her landlord. He was a man in his late 60s, with soft hands that had never fixed a leaky pipe, and a face that had perfected a look of benevolent disinterest. He was the kind of man who collected rent in cash and developed amnesia when asked for a receipt, the kind who addressed plumbing issues only when the problem threatened the apartment, below the kind whose politeness was a thin veneer over a core of pure contempt. He sat with his hands folded, a portrait of respectable civility, a man utterly convinced of his own blamelessness. At the far end of the room, on the elevated bench, sat Judge Evelyn Pierce. She was a woman known for two things: her razor-sharp legal mind and her absolute intolerance for what she called courtroom theatrics. Her eyes, magnified by reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, were still scanning a document. She hadn't looked up yet, but Imani felt her presence like a change in barometric pressure. The clerk's voice cut through the murmurs. Docket number 734, civil action. Jordan versus Finch. The plaintiff, Ms. Imani Jordan, is representing herself. Marcus Thorne let out a barely audible scoff, self-represented. the legal equivalent of a lamb wandering into a lion's den. Judge Pierce finally looked up. Her eyes swept past Finch and his lawyer, landing on Imani. She paused. Her gaze didn't fix on Imani's face, but slightly above it, at her hair. It was the first thing people like the judge always noticed. Imani wore her natural hair in a proud, full afro. It wasn't a quiet, demure style. It was a statement of existence, a bold, beautiful sphere of defiance in a world that preferred straight lines and conformity. In the sterile, beige landscape of the courtroom, her hair was a protest. "Ms. Jordan," the judge's voice was crisp, devoid of any warmth. "You are proceeding without counsel." "Yes, Your Honor," Imani replied. Her voice was steady, a clear, calm alto that didn't waver. It held no apology, no tremor of fear. "Very well," the judge said, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "Opening statements. The defense will begin." Marcus Thorne rose to his feet, smoothing the lapels of his $1,000 suit. He was a performer, and this was his stage. He launched into a speech that was smooth, practiced, and utterly detached from reality. He painted a picture of Imani as a disgruntled, uncooperative tenant. He used words like disruptive, failure to communicate, and history of complaints. He spoke of lease agreements and contractual obligations as if they were sacred texts. He never once mentioned the black mold that had colonized her bedroom wall, the ceiling that sagged with the weight of water from the apartment above, or the night Gerald Finch had hammered on her door at midnight, accusing her of harboring unauthorized guests when her sister had come to visit. He didn't have to. In that room, the presumption of her guilt hung in the air like cheap perfume. When he finished, he sat down with a self-satisfied smirk, glancing at the jury as if to say, "See simple." Imani waited. She let the silence left by his words stretch out, becoming awkward and heavy. She let the jury look at her, let the judge watch her, let them wonder what she could possibly have to say. Then she rose. She walked to the plaintiff's podium, placed her worn blue binder on the lectern, and adjusted the microphone. She didn't look at her notes. "My name is Imani Jordan," she began. Her voice didn't try to fill the room. It drew the room into it. "For the last 12 years, I was a middle school history teacher. I have never been late on a rent payment in my adult life. I have never been evicted. Until Mr. Finch decided my tenancy was no longer convenient." She paused, her eyes scanning the faces of the jury. "This case is not about a disagreement. It's about neglect. It's about what happens when a landlord believes a tenant has no power and a tenant dares to prove him wrong." She opened the binder. "I have here copies of 4 separate maintenance requests for a plumbing leak filed over a period of 6 months. I have 16 photographs documenting the resulting water damage and the spread of toxic black mold in my apartment. I have transcripts of 3 voicemails left for Mr. Finch's office, none of which were ever returned. I also have sworn affidavits from 2 other former tenants of Mr. Finch who are here in this courtroom today. They were forced to leave their homes for the exact same reason: neglect followed by retaliation." Someone in the back row shifted in their seat. Marcus Thorne's smirk had vanished, replaced by a tight, strained line. "Your Honor," Imani said, her gaze now fixed on the judge, "I am not a lawyer. I don't own a briefcase or a designer suit. I came here today with the truth organized in a 3-ring binder I bought at a dollar store. Mr. Thorne and his client are counting on you to see my lack of legal pedigree as a lack of credibility. They are counting on the idea that a man like him is inherently more believable than a woman like me. Her voice dropped, becoming more intimate, more powerful. I'm not here to ask you to like me. I'm not here to perform for your approval. I am here to demand that you see the facts. This case is about whether a landlord's legal responsibility to provide a safe, habitable home is optional. It's about whether his power to evict can be used as a weapon to silence those who ask for their basic rights to be honored. The courtroom was utterly still. Even the court stenographer had stopped typing, her fingers hovering over the keys. Judge Pierce slowly took off her glasses, polishing them with a cloth. She looked at Imani, truly looked at her this time, not at her hair or her clothes, but at the unshakable certainty in her eyes. Imani remained standing at the podium. She wasn't finished, not because she had more to say, but because for the first time since she'd walked through those doors, the silence in the room belonged to her. It was a silence filled with a dawning, uncomfortable understanding. And in that quiet, a system built on assumptions began to crack. The laughing had stopped. The recess was a brief 10-minute pocket of suspended reality. Marcus Thorne and Gerald Finch huddled together, whispering furiously, their confidence visibly corroded. Imani walked into the hallway and leaned against the cool wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't need water. She needed to anchor herself. She closed her eyes and took a deep, shuddering breath, picturing her grandmother's kitchen. The smell of yeast, rolls the sound of her voice, saying, "Stand so tall, baby, they can't see the top of you." When the doors opened again, she was the first one back inside. Judge Pierce was already on the bench, her expression unreadable, but intensely focused. The bored indifference was gone. She watched Imani with the sharp, concentrated gaze of a master chess player who just realized her opponent was not the novice she assumed. "Ms. Jordan," the judge said, her tone all business. "You may call your first witness." "Thank you, Your Honor." The plaintiff calls Ms. Elena Diaz to the stand. A small, weary-looking Latina woman in her 50s rose from the back and walked to the front. She wore nurse's scrubs and sensible shoes, and she clutched her purse so tightly her knuckles were white. After being sworn in, she sat down, her eyes darting nervously towards Gerald Finch. Imani gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Ms. Diaz, could you please tell the court where you resided until 3 months ago?" "Apartment 4C at the Fairmont Arms," she said, her voice soft. "And who was your landlord?" "Mr. Finch." "During your tenancy, did you experience any significant maintenance issues?" "Objection," Marcus Thorne said, jumping to his feet. "Relevance. This hearing is about Ms. Jordan's tenancy, not anyone else's." "Your Honor," Imani countered smoothly. Mr. Thorne's opening statement characterized Mr. Finch as a responsible landlord, and my complaints as an isolated incident. I am establishing a pattern of conduct. It speaks directly to motive and credibility. Judge Pierce paused for a beat. "Overruled. The witness will answer the question, but keep it concise, Ms. Jordan." "Yes, Your Honor." Imani turned back to Ms. Diaz. "Please continue." My heat went out last winter. In January, I called the office every day for a week. They kept saying someone would come. No one did. My son has asthma. The cold makes it worse. I had to buy 2 space heaters." "And what happened after you called?" "After a week of calling, Mr. Finch himself finally called me back. He told me I was being hysterical and that it was an old building. He said if I didn't like it, I could move." A juror, a middle-aged man with a construction worker's build, scribbled a note. "And what happened 2 months later, Ms. Diaz?" "I received a notice. My lease wasn't being renewed. No reason given. Thank you. No further questions? Thorne's cross-examination was brutal. He tried to paint Ms. Diaz as a difficult tenant, someone who was chronically late with her rent. Isn't it true, Ms. Diaz, that you were late with your rent 3 times last year? My son was in the hospital. She shot back her fear, replaced by a flash of indignation. I called and explained. I paid the late fee. I always paid. When she stepped down, Imani called her second witness, Mr. Elijah Washington, a black man in his 70s who walked with a cane. He detailed a collapsed ceiling in his bathroom from a leak he'd reported 6 months prior. He brought pictures. By the time the court broke for lunch, the atmosphere was transformed. The smugness had evaporated from the defense table. Gerald Finch sat stiffly, his face blotchy and red. Imani ate her sandwich in a small, empty conference room. She felt a presence in the doorway and looked up. It was the young, black juror from the morning on his way back from the cafeteria. He hesitated, then gave her a slow, deliberate nod. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental. It was a nod that said, "I see you. Keep going." The afternoon session began with Marcus Thorne calling his client to the stand. Gerald Finch walked up, took the oath, and settled into the witness chair, like a man lowering himself into a hot bath. "Mr. Finch," Thorne began, "do you harbor any racial prejudice against your tenants?" "Of course not," Finch said, looking offended. "That's an absurd accusation." "And do you recall the specifics of Ms. Jordan's complaints?" "Vaguely. Something about a leak. We get dozens of calls. I can't be expected to remember every single one." "And her non-renewal notice? Was it sent for retaliatory reasons?" "Absolutely not. It was a standard business decision." "Thank you. No further questions," Thorne said, turning with a flourish. Imani stood. "Mr. Finch," she began, her voice even. "Do you recall the evening of March 22nd of this year?" "Not specifically, no." "Let me refresh your memory. It was a Tuesday night. At approximately 10:45 p.m., you came to my apartment and pounded on my door demanding to know who was inside with me. Do you recall that?" Finch shifted. "I may have been doing a routine building check." "A routine check at nearly 11 o'clock at night?" Imani raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Finch, I have an audio recording of our conversation that night." "Objection," Thorne yelled, bolting upright. "Improperly introduced evidence. It was submitted as Exhibit G in my evidence binder, Your Honor," Imani said calmly. "A copy was provided to the defense last week." Judge Pierce looked at Thorne. "Is this true?" Thorne's face fell. His intern had clearly missed it. We will stipulate, Your Honor." "Then proceed, Ms. Jordan." Imani held up a transcript. "On this recording, Mr. Finch, after I informed you my sister was visiting you, I heard saying, and I quote, 'I don't care who it is. I'm tired of you people thinking you can do whatever you want. Girls like you get a little education and think you're smart, but smart don't pay the rent on time.' Do you recall saying that Mr. Finch, a deathly silence, consumed the courtroom?" Gerald Finch's face was the color of spoiled cream. He opened and closed his mouth like a fish. That could have been anyone." "It is your voice, Mr. Finch, and it is on a recording time-stamped by my phone. Would you like the court to play it?" "No," he mumbled, slumping in his chair. "No further questions, Your Honor." Imani walked back to her table. She didn't look at Finch or Thorne or the jury. She looked straight ahead at the seal of the state on the wall behind the judge's bench. It was supposed to represent justice for all. Today, she had decided to hold it to its word. Judge Pierce stared down at Gerald Finch for a long, cold moment. This court will reconvene at 9 a.m. tomorrow for closing arguments. Her gavel struck the block with the flat, final sound of a door slamming shut. The next morning, the room was packed. Word had spread. The other tenants were there, as were a few local housing advocates and a reporter from the city paper. When Imani walked in, the whispers stopped. She wore the same blazer, but today it looked less like thrift store clothing and more like a warrior's armor. She began her closing argument not with a summary of facts, but with a story. There is a concept in law called the reasonable person's standard. She began, her voice resonating with a new, quiet power. We are asked to consider what a reasonable person would do in a given situation, but the unspoken question has always been, who is that reasonable person? For too long, he has been a man. For too long, he has been white. He has been a person who has never had to wonder if the police would be called on him, for listening to music too loud if a landlord would see his skin color before he saw his rent check, if his own hair would be seen as a political statement. She looked directly at the jury. I did everything a reasonable person would do. I reported the leak. I documented the damage. I followed the rules. But I was not treated like a reasonable person. I was treated like a problem to be managed. And when I refused to be managed, I became a problem to be removed. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Mr. Finch and his lawyer want you to believe this is about a lease, a contract, a business transaction. But what happened to me was not business. It was personal. It was a punishment for daring to ask for the dignity of a safe home. It was a message sent to me and every other tenant who looks like me, know your place. Stay quiet. This courtroom isn't a magic box where fairness just appears. She concluded, her voice thick with emotion but unbroken. It is a place where we must demand it. Today, I am not just asking for damages. I am asking you to see what happened, to see why it happened, and to declare with your verdict that it will not be tolerated, not in this city, not anymore. She sat down. The silence that followed was profound, respectful. Marcus Thorne rose, but his usual swagger was gone. He looked deflated. His closing was a weak technical recitation of property law, a desperate appeal to process over people. It was the speech of a man who knew he had already lost. The jury was out for only 45 minutes. When they returned, the foreman, a white man who had looked skeptical on the first day, refused to look at the defense table. In the matter of Jordan versus Finch, he said, his voice firm, on the charge of retaliatory eviction, we find for the plaintiff, Ms. Imani Jordan. A collective exhale swept the room. Tears streamed down Elena Diaz's face. Mr. Washington pumped a fist quietly in the air. But Judge Pierce wasn't finished. In addition to awarding Ms. Jordan damages in the amount of $20,000, she announced, her voice ringing with newfound authority, this court is referring Mr. Gerald Finch to the state's Fair Housing Commission for a full investigation of all his properties. Furthermore, I am ordering Mr. Marcus Thorne to attend mandatory ethics and implicit bias training. She then looked directly at Imani, and for the first time her expression softened into something that looked like awe. Ms. Jordan, you came into this room without a law degree, but you demonstrated a more profound understanding of justice than many lawyers I have seen in my 20 years on this bench. You have reminded this court what it is for. We are all in your debt. 2 years later, the Raven House, a name Imani had chosen because the birds were smart, watchful, and never forgot a face was a vibrant hub in the community. It wasn't a law firm. It was a place with comfortable chairs, free coffee, and a copy machine that was always running. It occupied the ground floor of a building that had once been owned by Gerald Finch before the city's investigation forced him to sell his portfolio at a loss. Imani, now the executive director of her own non-profit funded by a combination of city grants and private donations, sat across the desk from a young couple, their baby sleeping in a stroller beside them. They were holding an eviction notice, their faces etched with fear and confusion. Imani listened. She took notes. She looked at their lease, her eyes expertly scanning the fine print. When they were finished, she looked up and smiled the same reassuring smile she had given Elena Diaz. "Okay," she said, her voice the calm center of their storm. "Here's what we're going to do." She hadn't set out to start a revolution. She had only wanted to fix a leak. But she had learned that sometimes the smallest crack, if you refuse to ignore it, can bring a whole rotten structure crashing down. And in its place, you can build something new, something that was not just fair, but just, something that felt like home. This story teaches us that the system doesn't change on its own. It is changed by the fearless, the prepared, the ones who refuse to be silenced. It's changed by those who walk into the lion's den not with a sword, but with a well-organized binder, and a truth that cannot be denied. If Imani's courage inspired you, show your support by liking this video and sharing it with anyone who has ever felt powerless. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that celebrate the incredible power of a single voice fighting for what is right. Your engagement helps us build a community dedicated to amplifying these essential narratives. Thank you for watching and for believing in the power of one.